Okay, so the last lecture we got to the lead up to the war. Let's start the war itself as far as the United States is concerned. Of course, the Second World War started long before the United States got involved. Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939. The war in Asia had already been going on for some time, as we talked about, but the war for the United States starts in 1941. A little bit of prelude. July of 1941, Japan had overrun French Indochina, what we would call today Vietnam and Laos, down on the South China Sea. This put it in a position to threaten the whole of the South China Sea. This gave Japan the opportunity to go after the Dutch West Indies. We'll take a look at a map in a minute. To go after the Dutch West Indies, today what we'd call Indonesia, which is where a lot of petroleum was and a lot of other natural resources, and really put them in a position to threaten that whole area of the world. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt had ordered an embargo, blocked all American shipping of oil, which was the big thing for Japan, and also important scrap iron. FDR told the Japanese that that embargo would only be lifted if Japan withdrew from China, we talked about last time, and Southeast Asia, French Indochina, in that area. This puts Japan in a position. Basically, they are stuck. They either have to go to war with the United States, or they have to withdraw all of their forces from what they considered their conquests. Japan pretended to negotiate from July 1941 through to December of 1941. United States had the Japanese had sent a special ambassador. They had their usual U.S. ambassador and a special envoy assisting him to Washington, and carried on these lengthy and elaborate negotiations that it turns out really were all a ploy. That militaristic cabinet we talked about that was running the show in Japan had decided to go for broke, to go after the United States, but they needed some time. They needed time to get their attack together and to gather their forces. So Japan pretended to negotiate, but in November, a good month before the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese had put together a fleet of aircraft carriers. Again, the Pearl Harbor attack was almost entirely airplanes. This is the new age of air power. Had put together a fleet of aircraft carriers, escorting vessels, and some miniature submarines. They had these tiny little two-man submarines that they used, and there's still a lot of research going on that today, by the way. Okay. We get to December 7th then. December 7th, 1941. The AP is unlikely to ask a lot of specific questions about this, but you should know. I mean, this is part of sort of general American knowledge. December 7th was a Sunday, which apparently the Japanese picked, among other things, because it was a Sunday. Pearl Harbor is a wonderful, really nicely built natural harbor in the Philippines, on the island of Oahu, not in the Philippines, in Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. Hawaii was not yet a state. It was still a territory of the United States. Americans were vaguely aware of Hawaii. They knew about it, but the importance of Hawaii at the time was that it was really a massive Navy and Army base. So you had Pearl Harbor itself, which was a large concentration of Navy force. It was really the entire Pacific Fleet was concentrated there. All of our battleships, which are the biggest of our ships, were in harbor at the time. A lot of smaller ships like destroyers, tender ships, which are service ships that resupply and do that sort of thing. And this is where the ships would go to lay up, give the crews chances for rest and relaxation, resupply, refuel, do repairs, all that sort of thing. There was also at Pearl Harbor a large air base. It was at the time there was no separate Air Force, so the Army Air Corps, part of the U.S. Army, was the equivalent of our Air Force. So Hickam Field was the really massive Army air base, and this was all, they were all right next to each other. So there you go. I mean, this Pearl Harbor was practically all of the ships and planes for the U.S. military in the Pacific were parked there. Luckily for the United States, on December 7th, although almost all of the ships were there, the only ships that were not there were our aircraft carriers. Our aircraft carriers were out at sea at that moment, and so they were not hit in this attack. And they were really the only major ships we had that were not destroyed in the December 7th attack. Anyway, it was 7:55 a.m. On a Sunday morning, which meant that the place was asleep. The soldiers and sailors were asleep, literally, or just getting up, having breakfast. Some of the ship's crews were doing the morning color ceremony, which is when everybody lines up and band plays the national anthem and they raise the flag. There were church services going on. I mean, this was really a sleepy time when everybody was off their guard. And the Japanese planes, as I said, it was almost entirely an air attack, came in undetected. There was actually a very, very primitive form of radar that picked them up as they came in, but because radar was so primitive, you couldn't tell what they were. And that, if you're really interested in this sort of thing, I don't know how many of you really enjoy military history, but you can go look it up, the radar on Pearl Harbor. But there was a guy practicing basically with one of these newfangled radar sets, and he saw something, but he didn't know what it was. And neither did anybody else, really. The planes came in, and there's actually film from that day of them destroying these ships. Maybe, why not? We'll take a minute to look at that. And let me just say, I'm showing you some of these pictures because you can go on and Google Pearl Harbor. You can see all these photos. There are also some films and some newsreels that I urge you to take the trouble to go and take a look at least just for a few minutes. But I'm showing you this because I want you to understand the impact this had on people. Most Americans were sitting at home on Sunday early afternoon. East Coast, it would have been about, it would have been the middle of the afternoon by the time these reports come through. The Pearl Harbor attack started at 7:55, which would have been, I think, about 1:55, so not quite 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So people, a lot of families in those days still had Sunday dinner tradition, so you'd have a big middle of the day lunch, or people were lounging around listening to the radio. There was concert series and things on the radio. So people were hanging around on a lazy Sunday, middle of the day, when they broke in to the radio program with the first reports of Pearl Harbor. And let me see if I can play one of those for you. Just ignore the blurry video behind this, but this is what this is typically how people found out about Pearl Harbor. And again, I'm showing you all this because I want you to get the impact this had. People felt pretty complacent in the United States. We wanted to stay out of the war. The economy was doing better than it had been. People had jobs. Things kind of seemed to be looking up. And as I said, it's a lazy Sunday afternoon. People are hanging out. Maybe they're just finishing up their meals. In the Midwest, the West Coast, they would have been just getting home from church, perhaps. And people tuned into the radio, no television in those days. And one of the big radio programs was the New York Philharmonic concert on CBS, which was the big, the Columbia Broadcasting System was the biggest of the networks at the time. So this is what people heard.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. We take you now to Washington.
Details are not available. They will be in a few minutes. The White House is now giving out a statement. The attack apparently was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. The President's brief statement was read to reporters by Stephen Early, the President's secretary. A Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor naturally would mean war. Such an attack would naturally bring a counterattack, and hostilities of this kind would naturally mean that the President would ask Congress for a declaration of war. There is no doubt from the temper of Congress that such a declaration would be granted. This morning, Secretary Hull talked with the Secretaries of War and of the Navy. Now the two special Japanese envoys, Admiral Nomura and Special Envoy Caruso, are at the State Department, engaged in conference with Secretary of State Hull. Their appearance at the State Department on this Sunday afternoon emphasizes the gravity of the Far Eastern situation, where hostilities now seem to be actually opening over the whole South Pacific.
I just want to pause there for a minute to point that out to you, if you just listen carefully to that. And that was absolutely true. The attack was launched on Pearl Harbor. The ambassadors in Washington had no idea that the attack had been launched, and in fact probably had no idea that an attack was going to be launched. They were being lied to by their government as much as the Americans were. They show up at the Secretary of State's office with this message that they were given by the Japanese government. The message said, look, negotiations are going no place. We really don't see any point in continuing negotiations. It doesn't really say we're going to war or about to attack you. Because they took so long to decode the message, they got there late. They walked into Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He was FDR Secretary of State. They walk into his office, and Hull just goes into meltdown at them. In just a fit of apoplexy at them, because Hull had already started receiving reports. They had gotten emergency cable transmissions from Pearl Harbor that they were under attack. The Japanese ambassador sitting in front of him did not know this. They didn't even know an attack was planned, and Hull is telling them what's going on in the Pacific. This is how surprising this was to everybody. Okay.
And just now comes the word from the President's office that a second air attack has been reported on Army and Navy bases in Manila. Thus, we have official announcement.
That was not actually true at that moment. Manila had not yet been attacked, but this was part of the confusion of the first few days, first few hours of this war. What had happened was this was all being transmitted by cables underneath the Pacific, and the Hawaiian, the cable had come through the Manila office, so people in Washington thought, oh, Manila's under attack too. It was not yet, although it was about to be placed under attack. They didn't know that yet. I'll just take a couple more minutes on this.
From the White House that Japanese airplanes have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and have now attacked Army and Navy bases in Manila.
Okay, now why did I want to play all that for you? It's because I want you to see that this was the moment for this generation. You guys have not really had one of these yet, I don't think. Thank God. I pray that you never do. But there are certain moments in American history that have they so strike people, they can tell you. And if you talk to your parents and your grandparents, they will tell you. I know my grandparents and all the people of their generation I knew, they could tell you precisely where they were, what they were doing, who they were with, what they were in the middle of what kind of sandwich they were eating, what kind of hand they had sitting at the poker table when they first heard that announcement that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. It was that defining second of the generation. The other ones really that you run into are Kennedy's assassination. People who were alive at the time can tell you precisely what they were doing and who with and where they were when they found out that Kennedy had been shot. And September 11th. Any of us who were alive at the time can tell you exactly where we were when we got the very first news that the World Trade Center had been attacked. Pearl Harbor really was the first of these in American history, not because it was the first big event, but I think because it was the first event that we had radio for. You know, before that, people would find out, like Fort Sumter, when Fort Sumter was fired upon for the Civil War, people found that out days later through newspapers. You know, newspapers were more efficient then, but they found out about Fort Sumter the next day in the newspaper or several days later if they were kind of out in the countryside. But Pearl Harbor takes place before we have TV, but when radio has really come into its own. Every household in America had a radio. People listened to it all the time. And so it had an immense impact, and it really blindsided people. I should also point out that a little what you saw there, and you can go online and look, find, Google up, YouTube up Pearl Harbor. People heard this on the radio. That was the first announcement. And then within a few weeks, really, because it took some weeks for the Navy to release the film by early 1942. People would go to the movies, and as I mentioned in class, you went to the movies, you really got something for your money. You didn't go in and just go in and see an hour-and-a-half movie. You went in, you got an hour-and-a-half main feature with the big stars and the big bucks. You got an hour and a half B movie picture, as they were called, which was cheaper to produce, less big stars, but entertaining. You often got a serial, which is about a 22-minute two-reeler, cowboy serial, meaning in a series. So it was episodic. It was a little piece of the story every week, science fiction or cowboys or something. You got a cartoon, you got this, you got that, and you got a newsreel. And it would show you pictures of what you had been reading about in the newspapers or had heard over the radio for the last week. So by early 1942, January 1942, you started to get newsreels of Pearl Harbor out there, and people could see for the first time the incredible devastation. You had 2,403 men, soldiers and sailors and Marines, who died at Pearl Harbor. All of the major ships of the United States were destroyed, except for those aircraft carriers. Dozens of airplanes. It was a tremendously traumatic event, which is why America turned on a dime. It went from being 80% in favor of staying completely out of the war to being 99% in favor of going and doing the job. I'll just show you this one picture. After the war, we actually captured a ton of film from the Japanese that the Japanese had taken in their own planes. They had cameras on the planes while they were bombing Pearl Harbor. They were using it to they did this a lot in war, figure out exactly how much damage they had caused and what they had done. And this is one of the very first pictures taken by those Japanese. Back here, that's Hickam Field, which is already in flames, having been initially bombed. But this is Battleship Row, it was called. These are all America's biggest battleships, and next to them are these tender and supply boats. And they came right in and just bang, 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 hit them one after another, and sunk them all. Okay. I'll just point out, by the way, that we focus on Pearl Harbor, but the same day as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also launched attacks on the Philippines, on Guam, on the island of Midway, Wake Island in the Pacific, Thailand, Shanghai, the Malay Peninsula, and within a couple of weeks they had also attacked Borneo, Hong Kong, and Burma, or as we call it now, Myanmar. Let me just show you what that's about. This is the master plan of the Japanese. You have to kind of get it. So there's Japan, right? Here's Hawaii, halfway between Japan and the United States, and this is where the center of American military presence is. There's Midway, there's Wake. Excuse me. You have the Philippines over here, Borneo you see over here, and this Java, all of this is the Dutch, it's called the Dutch West Indies. I mean the Dutch East Indies, excuse me, which was theoretically owned by the Dutch, but really this is where your oil is. Thailand's up here, Burma's up here. Burma's essentially part of the British spheres of influence. French Indochina, what we would call Vietnam, and then Laos up here, and Cambodia today. So what are they doing? There's Guam, by the way, too, in the middle. The Japanese want to accomplish a couple of things. Down here, in this blue line, this is where the majority of the oil is that they're looking for, the petroleum, and also some things like rubber and so on. So they want to make sure that they securely have and own this solidly. To do that, they want a way to create a ring around the whole area. So by hitting Wake, they will eventually take the Gilbert Island, the Marshall Islands, Kwajalein over here, and Tarawa. They're creating a sort of protective perimeter for themselves here, you see. So what's in the way of that perimeter? Well, Australia's outside of it, and this is the base of operations for the British. So they want to make sure they have a strong base down here to protect them from the British. They want to cut off China and this whole region from any help from anywhere else. So they take this. Now, this isn't a physical map, so you don't see. That's Tibet. You know what's in Tibet? The Himalayan mountains, which are effectively impassable. So if they can just start here, the Himalayas create a natural barrier there, so China's isolated. They start over here, all around. Manchuria, they own up here already. That's where their iron is coming from. So they've got themselves protected, and then by smacking the United States over here, they eliminate American ability to move into this area because we don't have a fleet to be able to do it. That's the theory of what they are trying to accomplish. In fact, just as I think I mentioned to you, the minute the South fired on Fort Sumter, they had already lost the war. So it can be argued the minute the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they lost the war. They won Pearl Harbor. They certainly really beat up the American fleet. And the United States would take a long time to be able to come back at Japan. But at the end of the day, this is extremely difficult to control. And the United States has tons of resources. So this was a fight that once the Japanese had smacked the United States in the eye, it was a matter of time, but they were going to lose. Okay. Now, I want to play for you what happened on December 8th. Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets reports all day long updating him on what happened. He makes arrangements then to address a joint session of the Congress, that is the House of Representatives and the Senate, meeting together as one body the next day. And he prepares a speech for them. It's not, as speeches go, it's not that long. It's his Day of Infamy speech, which is one of the finest speeches he gave, just on a matter of form and his ability to turn a phrase. And it's one of those that you should have heard once as an educated young person.
Members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and solicitation of Japan, still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking for the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleagues delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications for the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Well, Roosevelt, of course, got his declaration of war. Okay, so now we're in the war. And Japan has attacked us. And so obviously we go into war with Japan, right? Well, not exactly. Shortly after the United States declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on the United States because they had a treaty with Japan that anybody who went to war with Japan would be at war with Germany, and so the United States was also at war with Germany and Italy, all part of the Axis. The UK, the United States, and the Soviet Union all had reason to be at war with both of these groups of folks. They all had reason to be at war with Germany, but they also all had reason to be at war with Japan. And the decision was made by the three of them together, referred to as the Big Three. The UK led by Winston Churchill, the US led by Franklin Roosevelt, and the Soviet Union led by Joseph Stalin, agreed that they would make Germany the priority. First they would defeat Germany, then they would worry about Japan. Now, let me be clear. That does not mean that that was it, that we then ignored Japan until 1945. In fact, it is ironic, this very week, April 18th, will be the anniversary in 1942. So we had Pearl Harbor December of 41, so January, February, March, April 18th, 1942, just a few months later, of a thing called the Doolittle Raid. The Doolittle Raid was named for General James Doolittle, a U.S. Army Air Corps general, who came up with the idea. There was a movie made with Spencer Tracy, one of the great American actors, in it, about the Doolittle Raid, which is not actually all that inaccurate. You can find plenty of material about the Doolittle Raid. Briefly, from a military standpoint, what Doolittle wanted to do was to strike back at Japan. So he developed the idea of bombing Tokyo to get back at them for Pearl Harbor. Problem was, we didn't have a base close enough to Tokyo to be able to hit it with airplanes. Well, a mobile air base is a aircraft carrier. So Doolittle said, well, why don't we put the bombers on aircraft carriers? And the answer was, because you can't fit them. A bomber that would be large enough to carry bombs to inflict damage, and that could carry enough fuel to get you from the aircraft carrier to Tokyo, with the aircraft carrier far enough away that it wouldn't be detected and sunk. The only way to do it would be to use a heavy U.S. Army bomber, which were land-based. There was no way that you could take off. You didn't have enough runway space on an aircraft carrier to take off with them. Doolittle said, I'm going to do the impossible, and he did. He worked incredibly hard with incredibly motivated and clever crews, and they figured out how to get an Army bomber, first of all, onto an aircraft carrier, and then get it to take off from an aircraft carrier. So they pack the carriers with these Army bombers, fly them off, which was its own triumph. They get to Japan, to Tokyo. They actually bomb Tokyo with these bombs, and then the plan was to fly the planes across Japan into unoccupied China, the part of China the Japanese hadn't gotten yet, land the planes there, and then the planes would be available for the Chinese Air Force to use against the Japanese, and the guys would be saved. It didn't turn out that neatly. In fact, what happened was a lot of the planes ran out of fuel. They wound up crashing, some of them behind Japanese lines, others of them crashing, making crash landings in Chinese territory, but the guys getting pretty badly injured. But the Doolittle Raid was considered a big success. It was a propaganda victory because Americans could say, well, we didn't take this lying down. They punched us, so look at us. We punched right back. And the United States would fight the war in the Pacific from 42 on. Again, you can look up the history of it. There were a number of crucial sea battles, Battle of Midway being one of them. And the island campaign, where U.S. Marines mostly went from little island to little island. You must have heard of places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and island upon island that American GIs and Marines fought amphibious landings, took heavy casualties, but took back Japanese territory bit by bit, piece by piece. So it's not that we didn't do anything in the Pacific, but the priority everybody agreed on, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, was going to be first to go after Germany. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin actually met in person twice. Once at Tehran, which is in Iran, it's the capital of Iran even today, in 1943, where they agreed on opening the Second Front, as it was called. Basically, this was the agreement to go ahead with the D-Day landings in June of 1944, the purpose of which was to split the German forces. Germany is fighting the Russians in the east and the British, Americans, French in the west. Well, they had conquered France, so they didn't have a lot of fighting going on there. German Air Force was bombing Britain on a regular basis. German Navy was trying to sink American and British ships on a regular basis, but they didn't have a land war over there. So Stalin wanted very badly for the Americans and the British to open a land war over in France, to re-invade, if you want, the continent. Why? Because then the Germans would be forced to split half their forces to fight the Americans and only half their forces to fight the Russians. So that's why the Second Front was so important. We also all agreed at Tehran to fight to an unconditional surrender. We were not going to fight the Germans back to their original border and stop there and negotiate a treaty. We were not going to allow them to negotiate a partial withdrawal. We agreed that the only thing we would accept is complete, total defeat of Germany. And don't forget, that was a new idea too. The American Civil War, we fought until the South surrendered, but we sort of created conditions for them to do that. World War I was fought until there was an armistice, which is just a truce, and then they negotiated a peace treaty. And everybody basically stayed at the lines they had been before the war started. With World War II, we really are into this era of what's called total war, where entire societies are mobilized against each other. We're not just sending our armies out, but our whole economy is mobilized, our society is mobilized, and it's about total defeat of the other guy. So we agreed at Tehran that we would accept nothing less than Hitler's head on a stick, that the Germans would have to completely, totally, utterly surrender, give up their country, hand it over to us, and we would figure out what to do with it. They also met at Yalta, which is on the north coast of the Black Sea. It's over by the Ukraine. It had been won back at that point by the Russian army. And the three met at Yalta and decided on the division of Germany, that after the war, once we had conquered it, the Allies would split Germany up into pieces. Each ally would be responsible for part of it, and the idea was that would be temporary while we figured out how to rebuild German society denazified. The Russians also agreed to enter the war against the Japanese 3 months after the surrender of Germany. So once Germany surrendered, 3 months after that, the Russians agreed to turn their forces over toward Japan and join the United States and Britain, who were actually fighting over there. I put there in parentheses Potsdam. Potsdam happened after the war was over. It was also a meeting of the Big Three, except the Big Three were gone. Meaning, it was the U.S., the U.K., and the Soviet Union. By this time, the U.S. was represented by Harry Truman, the U.K. by Clement Attlee, who would replace Churchill, and the Soviet Union still by Stalin. And Potsdam is, another meeting of the Big Three, and that's where they really decide to divide up Europe, and Stalin takes control of Eastern Europe. I should also point out that although the Big Three met only twice, Churchill and Roosevelt met more often than that. They formed a thing called the North Atlantic Charter, which became the basis for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which really was the alliance of the West against Stalin and the East. So they were somewhat closer and had more communication. Okay. You can read the war in Chapter 35 in your books. There's no way for me to say this other than, the AP does not ask a lot of specific questions about the strategy of the war. You should have a general familiarity with it. We fought the war in Europe first. We fought in North Africa, where the British were already being pounded by the Germans. The Americans join and push the Germans out of North Africa. We then fight in Italy. You have the invasion of Sicily, and then from Sicily we launch the invasion of mainland Italy and fight the Germans up through Italy. The big moment comes in June of 1944 with D-Day, when British and American forces, joined by others, Canadians, Free French, the troops that had escaped from France, Free Polish forces, and so on, attack northern France, invade from there, sweep across northern France toward Germany. There is literally, and I'm not kidding or exaggerating, I could probably fill the entire high school building at Hill with books that have been written about the military strategy, the tactics, and the politics, and the personalities, and the events, and the people of the Second World War. There's almost endless amounts out there. Get the overview, read through the basics there. I want to touch upon some of the themes that relate directly to American history that AP emphasizes. So that means talking about how the war was affecting the home front. So the first thing I would point out is, on the home front, once we enter the war, you have these... there's almost no other word for it than production miracles. American industry gears up like nobody had ever seen for this war. Men are being drafted like crazy into the military. So you have guys being pulled in out of retirement. You have skilled workers being reassigned to other jobs, being taken out of non-essential industries and put into jobs that are essential for the war effort. You have younger workers being drawn in, and you have this whole second half of the population, women, being pulled in, so that you can run round-the-clock shifts in these factories. No longer is it 9 to 5. It's not even, 12-hour shifts or 18-hour shifts. They are running 24 hours a day in a lot of these factories. Just to give you an idea of the level of production, they are pumping out a new bomber airplane every hour. They create this thing called the Liberty ship. The Liberty ships were cargo ships for the U.S. Navy. They came up with a very specific design for them. Very solid ships. The Liberty ships were damn solid ships that there's still Liberty ships around that are afloat. Well-built, good things, but a sort of simplified, streamlined design. And they built them right here at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. If you guys are familiar with that area right down by the, not far from the Brooklyn Bridge, they were pumping out a Liberty ship every 17 days. It's sort of the equivalent of building a skyscraper, 2 skyscrapers a month. In 5 years of the war, that is from the time we started really Lend-Lease on, U.S. industry turns out 270,000 planes, 5,500 ships, and 100,000 tanks. Everybody gets involved. Henry Ford comes out of semi-retirement, along with guys like Henry Kaiser, who were, the great assembly line gurus, to show these companies how to do it even more efficiently. And you have this character, Rosie the Riveter. This is just one version of Rosie the Riveter. There was a song called Rosie the Riveter, which is where the name comes from. And the concept of, the housewife and mom turned construction worker turned riveter becomes so powerful that she starts to show up every place in different depictions of this mythical character of Rosie the Riveter as a sign for what women can really do. This is the Saturday Evening Post, which was one of the great magazines of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s even. Saturday Evening Post, great literary magazine. A lot of the great American writers got launched there. Great journalistic magazine. And they had great artists. I've mentioned this before in class. The 20s, 30s, 40s were the era of great illustrative artists. Some of the most famous names in American art were doing covers for various magazines. Really terrific stuff. If you like the history of art, look at the history of illustration of magazines in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But this is Norman Rockwell. How can you get more famous than Norman Rockwell as an American artist? And his take on Rosie the Riveter. There she is. It really was a revolution because, American women had worked in factories before, but it wasn't seen as a sign of women's strength. It was seen as a sign of necessity. Immigrant women working in the textile mills and so on. It wasn't a kind of empowerment. Rosie the Riveter is all about women's empowerment. They can do the job just as well as men, in part because they were doing men's jobs. Things like being a riveter, a welder, all kinds of jobs that were not that were thought to be for men only. You had to be a guy to do it, and here women were doing it, and it was kind of an empowering thing. It also was very empowering economically. There's a lot to talk about. We won't really get to, but about the war and economics. But I just point out, all the guys in the military were being paid. Didn't have much to spend their money on, being off overseas in foxholes and things. So they would send their money home, and it would be saved for them. All the women were also working. So you had two incomes coming into a lot of these houses. And there wasn't much for them to spend their money on either. We won't get a chance to do it, but during the war, a lot of things were rationed. Gasoline was rationed. You were only allowed to buy so much of it a week. A lot of different food items were rationed. It was not easy to get your hands on sugar, for instance, and meat was rationed, and you got a little ration book. If we were in class, I'd show it to you, because I actually have a bunch of ration books and things, but let me see if I can find one. Here you go. This is... There were many different versions of the ration book, so I just want to give you an idea a bit of how they worked. So this was inside of this. You were issued a book, and it depended on who you were and what you did, how much ration you got. So, kids got a certain, you got, depending on how many kids you got a certain number of ration books. If you had a particularly strenuous job, therefore theoretically you'd need more calories every week to burn, you got a different kind of ration book. And so you got these. When you went down to the supermarket, and supermarkets were really just beginning to come in then, you still had old-fashioned grocery stores. You go in and you buy what you wanted, you pick out stuff off the shelf, presuming they had it. And then when you went up to pay for it, you had to detach stamps, these ration stamps, depending on what you were buying. So, and if you went around the supermarket, everything was marked. So a can of, or a loaf of bread, let's say, was worth 1 ration point of wheat. So you take one of those off, and a large can of vegetables would be worth 2 vegetable ration. So you'd have to pull out 2 points of this for that. And when you had gone through all of your stamps, that was it. You couldn't buy anymore. United States rationing was not terribly bad, in the sense that the British rationing was really, really, really harsh. Everything had to be imported to Britain, and so the people in Britain really, they a lot of them were hungry all the time. The government didn't starve them to death, but it was really hard to make a birthday cake for your kid, given the amount of sugar ration and so on that you had. In the United States, things never really got quite that bad, but you had to be a little bit picky. You had to be a little bit careful. Gas rationing was very important. Not so much because gasoline was a problem, but believe it or not, the rationing of gas was about saving rubber. Less gas you had, the less you could drive, the less you would need rubber for your tires. And rubber was difficult to get. You had to get it from occupied Japanese territory, so there wasn't enough of it around. And they didn't want it going... The big thing was they didn't want it going to civilians, because the military needed as much of it as they could get their hands on. So that was kind of the point of rationing. Anyway, to get back to my original point, the Rosie the Riveters, and here are 2 of them right there, they didn't have a lot to spend their money on either, luxury items of much. So, people went out to the movies a lot in those days because you didn't have TV at home, but there wasn't all that much else. So they were putting money away too. So you had lots of money going into savings accounts. And after the war, that would be available for a sort of burst of consumer spending. But it also gave women empowerment. Having money in the savings account, having money in your pocket, kind of gives you a kind of independence. And so that whole Rosie the Riveter thing, what's to take away from that? Well, women were as much a part of the war as men were. They didn't fight on the front lines, but they fought by giving their all in the factories of America, and there was really a powerful sense of patriotism from that. It really shattered a lot of the stereotypical women's roles. oh, well, women can't rivet, women can't weld, women can't do plumbing and electrical work and all. Well, yes, they can. And it gave them a kind of economic empowerment, at least for a brief period of time, before we went into the 1950s. So that's an important point there. Let's talk briefly about some of the other bits and pieces here. Okay, so when we talk about then some of the other groups on the home front, African Americans. Black men served in the military, but many of them served in incredibly brave capacities and crucial capacities. There was a operation in Europe, they won't ask you this on AP, but called the Red Ball Express, which was a combat supply operation, which was almost all African American soldiers, which was, they did an incredible job on. But black soldiers and black sailors continued to serve in either segregated units, that is all black units, or in sort of subservient roles. So by segregated units, I mean that you had, and there's some Hollywood movies about this, the Tuskegee Airmen, named for the Tuskegee Institute. This was an all-black unit of pilots who, no white men, and they were not, the black guys were not allowed to serve in regular white units. It was still segregated. They were mistreated. Tuskegee Airmen were fully qualified, great pilots, but they had a terrible time trying to get airplanes, literally, to supply them with. So you still had segregated units in the war, and in situations where you had black soldiers and sailors who actually served with white soldiers, they were in literally subservient roles. So, for instance, if you went aboard a U.S. Navy ship, the officers were all white, the sailors were all white, but often the stewards were black. And what were the stewards? The stewards were the cooks, and you had, for want of a better word, kind of waiters. In a big Navy ship, these were the guys in charge of putting out the meals, washing the dishes, that sort of thing. Sometimes got involved with doing the laundry and like that. So, they were in subservient roles. In the Army, it was not unknown for a white officer like General George Patton to have an orderly who, an orderly is a soldier assigned to a general who's in charge of doing things like keeping his uniform clean, shining his brass and his boots, who was a black man. Back on the home front, blacks continued that migration we talked about to the north, out of the south, into the great industrial cities. Why? You have now this big boom again in industry. We talked about that before World War I. So blacks are moving up to try to, get jobs working in defense industries, which was great. And again, they worked very hard, but they were still discriminated against. A. Philip Randolph, whom you should remember from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Pullman strike. Remember him? He's still around at this time. 1941, organized a march on Washington to protest discrimination in the workplace. That march on Washington, by the way, in 1941, is, we'll see later, but I'm sure you've heard of Martin Luther King, the March on Washington. That wasn't something that just got started the year King did it. It was something that had been going on over and over again, and it went back to A. Philip Randolph. So he did this march on Washington in 1941 to protest against discrimination in the workplace. FDR really didn't want at that point in his administration a protest march in Washington. He didn't need it of any kind. Eleanor goes to him and gets him to sign an executive order banning discrimination in defense industries and government agencies. So it doesn't really apply to the military, but if you went to work in a plant that made tanks for the Army, the idea was that you couldn't turn a guy down for work just because he's black. So it was a first step, and Eleanor is getting FDR to go along with this as a first step toward real integration. There was a real feeling, blacks were not stupid. They still are not stupid. And they were aware that they were fighting for democracy and freedom overseas while still being discriminated against at home. So there was a feeling that it was called the Double V campaign, the Double Victory campaign. If we, fight to win overseas, then that'll help us here at home. We'll prove, that we have a right to end discrimination here too. Okay, let's talk briefly about Native Americans. Again, awful lot of American Indians served in the military in all sorts of various capacities. A lot of Native American women were Rosie the Riveters too. They were, everybody's looking for jobs, so they found jobs in the defense industry. The most famous thing, though, and there was, again, a Hollywood movie made about it, were the Navajo code talkers, which, the Hollywood movie is a little bit too Hollywood, but it is an interesting story. Native American languages are very complex, and they've never really been well classified. You guys know you're taking Romance languages based on the Roman language, so Italian, Spanish, French, they're all based in Latin, and Latin is an Indo-European language. It's related to Greek, it's related to the Slavic languages, it's related to German, because there's a parent language to that, and we have all these categorizations and studies of these languages. The languages of North American Indians have never really been able to be analyzed that way. Part of it is because we don't have enough about them to be able to do that, to make comparisons. Not enough of them have survived, and not enough of any individual language has survived to do that well. And possibly because they can't be categorized that way. All right, what's that got to do with anything? The Navajo language was never written down. It was passed on by word of mouth, father to son, mother to daughter. And it is unrelated to any other language on the planet. So during the war, you need a way to communicate securely. Remember, all communication in the field is done by radio, open radio. Not even a secure scrambled cell phone. Just anybody can tune in to any broadcast. So you have to find a way to encode your messages. Well, that's easy to do if everybody's got pencil and paper and you can sit down and come up with a code, and then you send a coded message and they decode it. But what do you do if you're sending signals back and forth from foxholes on a beach where you're under fire? You're not sitting in nice offices exchanging intelligence information. You've got artillery pounding around you, and you're lying on a beach trying to invade a small island, and you want to talk to the artillery unit that's down the beach from you, where you need to get a message back to the ships that are bringing guys in. How are you going to encode it there? And they came up with this brilliant idea. Why don't we just put a Navajo kid on each end of that conversation? So the U.S. Marines recruited 200 or so Navajo young men, teenagers, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, who knew the Navajo language and made them all radio operators. So they would get on these radios and talk to each other in Navajo. And it didn't matter if the Japanese intercepted it, because the Japanese did not know a blasted thing about the Navajo language. In fact, if you weren't a Navajo, chances were you didn't. There was almost nobody outside the Navajo community that knew the slightest thing about this language. So the Navajo Code Talker thing was a little, it's just a little story in the war, but it's a brilliant little story. And shows you, what can be achieved with cleverness. The Navajo Code Talkers were a famous incident. There were other Native Americans who contributed to their country. You have all seen, I hope, the Iwo Jima monument in Arlington. The monument that's based on this famous photograph. This photograph has its own fascinating and incredibly complex history. And if you're interested in it, I urge you to go look up Joe Rosenthal, who's the guy who took the photo, and the history of this photo and how it happened. It's a surprising story, but it's just one little thing I point out to you. This is the ultimate symbol of the Marine Corps here. This is the most famous photograph of the Second World War, maybe the most famous war photograph ever. And one of the guys on here, I think it's the guy in the end, but I might be wrong about that. I should look that up, is Ira Hayes. Ira Hayes was another Native American who fought in the Marine Corps. He was not Navajo. He was a different tribe, but just represented a lot of the Native Americans who fought in the war. Okay, as far as Latinos go, thing to remember is the Zoot Suit riots, for real. When you talked about Latinos in the United States of America, at the time, you meant overwhelmingly Mexicans in the American Southwest. You did not have, in the 40s, you did not yet have large immigration from Puerto Rico to New York. That would happen in the 50s. You didn't have Ecuadorians, you didn't have Hondurans, and you didn't really have immigration of Mexicans into other parts of the country. They were not coming to New York or Pennsylvania yet. Latinos in the United States meant Mexican, Texicans, if you like, down in Texas along the border, and Mexican Americans who lived in Southern California and that area. You had about 3 million Mexican Americans who lived in the Los Angeles area, and the hip thing at the time was the Zoot Suit. Now this guy here is Cab Calloway, one of the greatest American jazz and pop musicians ever. He was not Latino. He was black. He was African American, but that's him wearing a somewhat exaggerated zoot suit. You see the baggy pants, the watch chain, the baggy coat, the bow tie, and the hat. It may not be your taste. I don't care. But just as much as the saggy jeans or the skinny jeans or the ripped t-shirts or the not ripped t-shirts or the pink or the whatever, you guys wear, the zoot suit was their way of showing rebellion, of showing class, of showing style and pizzazz and identity. You guys know, I'm sure far better than I do, that by looking at how a kid dresses, what they wear, what they refuse to wear, you can tell where they fit in to any particular social group. At Hill, it's a little hard because you all wear uniforms every day, but you know that if you go into the typical public high school, you can spot the jocks, you can spot the goths, you can spot the artistic semi-punk types, you can spot the fashionistas, right? Everybody's got their thing. So the zoot suit was the jazz hipster outfit, and it was very popular with the Latinos in Los Angeles. Okay, now this is going to seem really odd, but this is the truth. The zoot suit was expensive and difficult to manufacture during the war. One of the things that was rationed was cloth. Cloth and textiles were needed by the military for a whole variety of things. Uniforms, of course, but an awful lot of other stuff too. You'd be surprised what cloth is used for in the military. Used to hold gunpowder for the large bore naval weapons and so on. So cloth was pretty heavily rationed. That meant that theoretically you shouldn't be able to buy or make a zoot suit because it just is too baggy, takes way too much cloth, and you shouldn't be able to do it. And yet somehow these Latino kids in Los Angeles in the 40s were able to do this. How? Because there were, for want of a better word, bootleg tailors who, for a price would get you what you wanted and continue to make it. Well, you had a lot of soldiers and sailors also in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a major port city, so the Navy was in there. There were Army bases nearby. And they resented these young Latinos. They saw them parading around in these outfits, and they saw them as unpatriotic, as punks, as kind of throwing it in the faces of the military, as youthful rebellion. Well, what happens when you get a 19-year-old Latino who's being pretty discriminated against in American society at the time, and who's walking around proudly in a zoot suit up against a 19-year-old sailor from the Midwest who feels like his family and he are sacrificing for the cause and you're not, particularly when they both get a couple of beers in them, you're gonna start having fist fly, right? Okay, so then this is what happened. You get these kids who get cornered by a couple of sailors, couple of soldiers, and they get beaten 3/4 to death and stripped and humiliated. This begins happening in June of 1943. And you can see, you got young guys, soldiers, who were either drafted and maybe not too happy about it, or joined up feeling patriotic, and they're looking at guys their same age who for some reason aren't getting drafted or haven't signed up, and don't they love America? And then I'm walking around in uniform and they're walking around in their zoot suits. This leads to resentment. And when you have that many soldiers and sailors in a particular town, you have like a secondary police force. You've got the cops, your regular Los Angeles police, but you also have Shore Patrol, SP, which is the Navy military police, and Army MPs patrolling as well. And guess whose side they're going to take in a lot of this stuff. And, tensions escalate. Tensions mount, and you start to see a lot of these Latino kids getting the hell beaten out of them, others of them being picked up, presumed what we would call today gang members and just punks, and it leads in 1943, in June of 43, to several weeks of pretty intense rioting, with soldiers and their buddies driving around the streets of Los Angeles looking for guys to rip the clothing off of, and more and worse. As I said, things got pretty violent between the Zoot Suiters and the military on both sides, and it led to riots in a whole ton of cities. After the initial riots in Los Angeles, you had riots in other cities on the coast, and then it started leading to riots in Detroit, in New York even. It took on almost a life of its own, and for several weeks there, for a month and a half, you had some of the most brutal race riots between Latinos and whites that you had had to that date. It really got kind of out of hand. It's now kind of a semi-forgotten moment in American history, but it would lead to simmering resentment later on between the Latino community and the white community. Okay, and then finally in this regard, I want to talk about the internment of Japanese-Americans. You can imagine right after Pearl Harbor, people were completely freaked out. There were a lot of Japanese Americans living in Hawaii itself and on the west coast of the United States in particular, and there was sudden suspicion. Every Japanese person was a potential traitor, was a potential threat, was a potential, we would say now, a potential terrorist, right? So what do? Angry Americans were out to take revenge on them. The government was freaked out and didn't know what to do for security, so the decision was made to move Americans of Japanese ancestry, that's about 110,000 people on the west coast alone, to evacuate them inland to camps where they would concentrate them, put them all in one place. The word concentration camp had not yet come to mean what we think of. So in early 1942, remember, December 7th, 1941, so by February 42, just a few months later, Roosevelt issues an executive order. It's an order from the president that authorizes the military to move all the Japanese Americans living near the coasts of the United States inland. That's about 110,000 people, as I said, were moved to camps well inland on basically wasteland that were on federal land. It was owned by the federal government, the land. None of them were accused of anything. This was not done as a judicial punishment. They were not accused of committing a crime, of espionage. They weren't suspected of anything. It simply was used as a sort of wartime safety measure, was the idea of it. And these people lost everything. I mean, they were given, short period of time to move out, give up their businesses. These are shop owners. These are people who have little professions going, move out of their family homes, pack up whatever they could bundle up, and take it with them to a kind of summer camp hut out in the middle of the desert on federal land, where they were all kept for the duration of the war. The internment of the Japanese is considered to be the most serious violation of civil liberties that the United States has ever undertaken. There was one guy who fought it, a guy named Fred Korematsu, Korematsu, who took his case to the Supreme Court, Korematsu versus the United States. And the Supreme Court instead of defending the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, the constitutional rights of these American citizens, all of them, by the way, were American citizens. We're not talking about, Japanese visiting the United States or Japanese here on a passport or a visa. So we're American citizens. not just American citizens, born in the United States. Their parents were from Japan, or grandparents in some cases were from Japan. But the Supreme Court found that there was an imminent danger to public safety by letting them continue to, run around and have freedom of speech and freedom to make a living and freedom to have a business. The Japanese internment has since become a matter of much historical controversy, and I think an awful lot of people would hold it to be one of the most shameful episodes in American history. I think most people would agree on that today, but that was part of the American scene too. These people were targeted just because of who their grandparents were, and not for anything they actually did. And the United States, with no judicial proceeding, they didn't go in front of a judge and have to prove that these people were individual dangers. You had an ancestor from Japan, that was good enough. We're taking everything away from putting you in a camp until the end of the war. I should also point out, did Japanese Americans serve in the military? You bet. In fact, there was a whole unit of Japanese Americans who served in World War II. It was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was a unit of guys, and watch this, this was a unit of guys, all of them Japanese or of Japanese descent. Most of them had family that was at that moment being interred in one of these government camps with their rights, businesses, money, everything else taken away. These guys volunteered, were not drafted, they volunteered to go into the army to serve, to prove how American they were. They were sent over to Germany, so they fought in Europe, and they proved there were 14,000 men who served in this unit. That was because a regimental unit, regimental combat team, has about 4,000 guys in it. So you started with 4,000 guys. They had so many guys killed in action and wounded that they had to replace them 2.5 times. So you actually wound up having a total of 14,000 guys who served in this unit. They earned 9,500 Purple Hearts. A Purple Heart is a medal given to you for having been wounded in combat. The unit received 8 Presidential Unit Citations. That's a medal that's given to a unit as a whole unit. Mostly medals are given to individual guys. Presidential Unit Citation is a medal that's given to the unit. No other unit has received 8 Presidential Unit Citations. 21 members of this unit earned the Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration. The second highest decoration in the U.S. military is the Distinguished Service Cross. 52 guys got Distinguished Service Crosses. The third highest decoration is the Silver Star. 560 guys got the Silver Star. And the fourth highest decoration for combat is the Bronze Star. 4,000 guys got Bronze Stars in this unit. That is absolutely extraordinary. There is no other unit that has a record anywhere near approaching that. So for all of the worry that Japanese Americans wouldn't be as patriotic as anyone else, the guys who volunteered, and as I said, you think about 110,000 Japanese Americans were interred, 14,000 Japanese Americans, so more than 10% served in this unit, and you look at their record of those 14,000 guys, about 2/3 of them were wounded in combat. I mean, that's incredible. That's extraordinary. So anyway, so that's the Japanese-American experience during the war. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'll pick up then with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because that's not only going to get us to the end of the war, but it's going to get us into the Cold War. So we'll pick up with that and some of the material that's in Chapter 36 next time.